Hello everyone, welcome to today's ARI Seminar. I'm Fern Hames from the Arthur Rylah Institute. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands, various lands on which we're meeting today, right across Victoria and beyond Victoria as well. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country. I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and elders past and present, and any Aboriginal people or First Nations people that we might have with us today, and acknowledge the role of healing country in some of the content that we're about to talk about today. I'd also like to mention that this is a pretty special ARI seminar today because it's the first live event in the Victoria Nature Festival 2021. So there's so many things happening as part of the Nature Festival. Jump online and check them out. There are fabulous things on every day for learning about, hearing about, getting excited about, doing all sorts of things to do with nature. So I encourage you to check that out. And of course it's September, which always means Biodiversity Month. So multiple reasons to be here today and to hear what's been happening in fire affected areas since those terrible fires in our Black Summer. I want to thank everybody who's speaking today. We've got such a great lineup. Some of them you will know as just absolute legends of biodiversity research in Victoria. Some of them might be more emerging legends that you're starting to hear about a lot in Victoria. But it's so exciting to have everyone here, and deep gratitude to you for speaking today. And thanks to everyone who's come along to listen in. We're going to hear right across a range of taxa and what's been happening. So I'm going to now jump to Tim. Tim O'Brien is going to introduce the session and tell us a bit more about what we're going to hear about today. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Fern, and welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. So first of all, just give you an overview of the agenda here. So there's going to be myself giving an introduction and then 4 targeted talks on some of the assessments that we were done through the post-bushfire recovery period, and then question time will be at the end. So if you could please post your questions into the chat, and Andy will do some emceeing at the end and help coordinate us with some answers for those. And if we don't get to them all, of course, we'll try and post some answers in the chat afterwards as well. So I'll give you a bit of an overview of the program, and I'll just make a note of the bottom. There's a couple of web links there at the bottom where a lot of this information will be captured or has already been captured. So there's the main biodiversity response and recovery website. There's a link here for that. There is a consolidated report to come out of the work that we're talking about today, and obviously just giving you a snapshot of some of the activities there. That's in press at the moment, and that should be on the website soon. And then there's the ARI website, which captures quite a bit of fire recovery work and fire monitoring work from not just these fires, but previous fires as well. So I'll jump forward to the next slide. And the main objectives of this work post fires last year was to, first of all, was a triage identifying which flora, fauna and habitats were most at risk. And with 1.5 million hectares burnt, there was a lot of species that were affected by these fires. More than 3,500 plants and vertebrates, countless invertebrates. And it was quite a substantial effort to triage those, identify which ones we were most concerned about. And there was a list of 42 rare or threatened species with more than 50% of their known habitat that was burnt at a high severity fire. And obviously the higher the severity of the fire, the more likely the impacts are to be, produce the highest risks for those species. We then went through an expert desktop assessment to identify which species we could actually practically go and assess. So this might be access post-fire due to logistics, which species might be observable immediately post-fire, so some plants won't emerge for some time after the fires, and also obviously in light of what resources we had. The key element of us being able to do this was the rapid approval of funding. It was by far the best we've had any post-fire period. This report that was produced very early on, identifying the risks, was really well supported by government. Funding flowed really quickly. We were able to get teams out in the field very quickly. So that was a really positive of this particular post-fire response. And then obviously what we want to do with that information is not just about going out and seeing what's going on. Of course, that's important, but then making recommendations for some direct action or for further assessment and prioritisation. So some of that's done by strategic management prospects, which is the Biodiversity Division's tool for evaluating risks and threats and actions. And then some of these more targeted sort of rarer species, is what's called a specific needs analysis was done for those. Page down. And very quickly, I'm not going to read through this, but the broad list of activities focused on these species and communities here, and were delivered by a very broad range of people listed on this table. This presentation will be available later, so I'm not going to try and go through this, but you can look it up later if you need to. And key messages from the assessments. Early assessments are vital for species at risk. Lots of risks observed out in the field. So deer, foxes, invasive plants, chytrid were widespread, affecting many of the species that were studied. Protection of remnant, unburnt and low severity fire areas is really critical. These refuges are really important into the future. And what we found was a recurring message through many of the assessments were, for the species and communities we had pre-existing information for, we were able to tell a much better story about what the impact of the fires were. This is really critical. Things we had good information for, we could go and get a really clear picture. Things we went out and just assessed because we knew there was a potential for threatened species out there. We could go and say, yes, there was something found or not found, but oftentimes we weren't able to assess the risk, the impact of the fires and what the threats were occurring. So message from that is robust, long-term, well-managed data sets are critical. And final slide, key element of the program was collaboration. We had great range of collaborators here, and there's a list of them on the slide here. This delivered significant benefits both for resourcing, having staff available to go and do the assessments, sharing of expertise and data, and this really helped deliver the best outcomes. And it's something we should look to build on in the future. So on that note, I'll hand over to Arn Tolsma now, who's going to talk to us about some of the threat and flora work he did.
Okay, thanks for all that. My name's Arn Tolsma. I'm a senior scientist here at the Arthur Rylah Institute, and I'm talking today about post-fire recovery of threatened plant species and communities. Fire can have a major impact on plants. Some species may take a long time to reach reproductive maturity, and they're killed by fires at too short an interval. They may grow in sensitive habitats that are rarely burnt, or have no local source of propagules after being killed. Or they may already be in trouble because of drought, overgrazing or other disturbance. Habitat distribution models, such as the example one shown here, suggest that nearly 700 Victorian rare or threatened plant species had at least some of their habitat within the fire footprint. Now, the post-fire response by many of these species has not been adequately documented, so there was a lot of uncertainty about the impact of such intense fires on species, or their capacity to regenerate and persist in the landscape. Reconnaissance surveys were therefore an important part of the post-fire management effort, and our aim was to relocate known populations of threatened species that have been recorded in the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas and document the state of recovery and risks to their recovery. We certainly couldn't assess nearly 700 plant species, so it was important to come up with a reasonable list of priority species to have a bit of a crack at. So to narrow down the list, we focus on species identified as being of particular concern by various assessors or agencies, and species that had more than half of their recorded populations burnt at high severity, under the assumption that they would be the most impacted. One of those species, Betka bottlebrush, is shown in the map there. It's known from only 2 locations in East Gippsland, both of them burnt at high severity, which is why this species became one of our high priorities. Ultimately, we, and by we I mean the Arthur Rylah Institute, Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, and some really handy regional volunteers, undertook searches for 126 Victorian threatened species spread out across 287 known populations in eastern Victoria. We found 108 of these species, and they were successfully regenerating from seed or from resprouts or from a combination of both seeds and resprouts. Now, some species were easy to find, as you'd expect, especially when they were big or colourful, or we had really good location information. As an example, we have our Betka bottlebrush on the left, which, as I mentioned before, is found in only a couple of places in Victoria. The location records we had were really accurate, so we knew exactly where to go to find them, and the reef sprouts were 1/2 metre high, making them easy to see. Other species such as rush lily on the right were flowering profusely in low, pretty open heathland vegetation, and the populations could be readily found even if the location records were not that accurate. In fact, that species you could just about do your botanical work from the car. And some species proved to be more of a challenge. In some instances, the GPS waypoint put us in a spot that just looked wrong, and that suggested that the plants had never been there. And as an example, the waypoint for a drainage line species may have been near the top of a hill, and the real location of the population could have been anywhere around the stream. So we then had to search a far bigger area than planned and had a lot less chance of successfully finding it. Other populations may have been there once, but are not there now for various reasons. It could have been due to the recent fire, or the recent fire combined with some previous fire or other disturbance, or some other factor not related to the fire at all. And sometimes the plants might still be there, but they were just too small to identify with any confidence. And this was especially the case with many obligate seed or shrub species. These are killed by fire and can't resprout. And we often saw lots of seedlings, but we couldn't confirm whether they were from the rare species or a more common one. Ultimately, out of the 126 species that we searched for, there were 18 that we couldn't find yet, and we may just need to give them more time. The post-fire recovery of plant structure and composition was strongly related to how hot the fire was, the type of vegetation in question, and the regeneration mode of individual plants. For example, damp heathland near the coast, which you can see on the left, it's well adapted to fire, and it responded quickly with vigorous resprouting of most species. Crimson bottlebrush was flowering profusely within just a year of the fire. There was dense cover of sedgy and shrubby vegetation across the heathland. But at the other extreme, dry forest was often burnt severely, and that was especially on ridges or steep slopes, and recovery was often at a very, very early stage. There was a bit of epiconic growth on the eucalypts, as you can see there, but a year after the fire, there was barely any cover of understory species and almost nothing to protect the bare soil from erosion. One of the vegetation types we were most concerned about was rainforest, which is known to be sensitive to fire. And for a brief case study, I want to look at warm temperate rainforest. About 5,500 hectares of this rainforest type was burnt at high intensity during the fires, and that's 1/3 of the total amount of warm temperate rainforest in Victoria. And this figure doesn't even include forests burnt at low or moderate intensity, so there's no doubt that the overall impacts of the fire are understated here. 1 year after the fire, the understory was very different to what it was before the fire. The long-lived perennial rainforest species have been temporarily replaced by rapid-growing pioneer species. We had some spots that were dominated by 3-metre high kangaroo apple, which was a real challenge to push through. Other spots were dominated by incense plant or Indian weed, and that's a really annoying plant that leaves your clothes covered in sticky plant material. But despite their appearance or their name, none of these species are actually weeds. They're simply short-lived native species, and they've got seeds that can live a long time in the soil seed bank, just waiting to take advantage of the opportunity provided by the fire and strut their stuff in the absence of competition. These fires will eventually reduce substantially in cover over time as typical rainforest species grow back. The rainforest canopy is also very different at the moment, with the regeneration of canopy trees strongly related to local fire intensities, as you can see here with lily-pilly. When fire intensity was low, as on the left, the canopy was generally lightly scorched rather than burnt, and it was resprouting within a year of the fire, and that resprouting was evident, right up to the upper branches. But when the fire intensity was high, as on the right-hand side, the canopy, even the top of the trunk, was killed, and resprouting was often limited to the very base of the trunk. In this instance, the re-establishment of a mature rainforest canopy is expected to take many decades. But recovery time is not the only problem for the rainforest canopy, and a more serious canopy looks like it's going to be the development of a eucalypt canopy. We counted the number of eucalypt seedlings in small 50 square metre plots at each site, and these are the values at the y-axis. We then estimated the distance from the centre of each plot to the nearest mature eucalypt that could have acted as a post-fire seed source. And you can see along the x-axis that in those plots where the distance to a mature eucalypt was 50 metres or more, there were no eucalypt seedlings counted. But as the distance to a mature eucalypt got smaller, as you came back along the x-axis, there were up to 20 seedlings in a plot, which equates to 4,000 seedlings per hectare. So eucalypts are invading the rainforest edges, perhaps to 30 to 40 metres in. It's worth mentioning that this graph is remarkably similar to one we generated for cool temperate rainforest after the 2009 forest fires. And that suggests to us that small or linear patches of rainforest could be in real trouble, and they may eventually disappear as they become dominated by eucalypts. So with climate change potentially leading to an increasing number of fires, the long-term future of many rainforests, whether they're cool temperate or warm temperate forests, is looking decidedly uncertain. Finally, I'd like to thank all the botanists, support staff and volunteers that provided recovery data and information and assistance. And thanks for listening to my talk. And now I'd like to hand over to the next presenter.
Yeah, hello. I'm Tamo Radic. I lead the Aquatic Biodiversity and Conservation Program at the Arthur Rylah Institute. This presentation is only really a snapshot of our post-fire conservation efforts in 2020, mainly in East Gippsland, but a very small portion of it is also was also undertaken in the Glenelg River system. A little bit of background. So aquatic fauna, meaning something that's wet and fire, what is the issue? Well, there are still direct fire impacts on aquatic environments, and that's mainly related to either the water heating up or evaporating. Now that has low to medium consequences for aquatic fauna, depending on how much water there is and how intense the fire is. There are also fire suppression activities that cause impacts, such as retardant and foam that ends up in catchments and gets washed into streams, but also machinery moving through creek lines. Now these are also low, but also could be high consequence impacts. But the major impact to aquatic environments occurs immediately after the fire when the vegetation has been removed. This tends to happen during high intensity localised rainfall events, and a lot of the soil has become hydrophobic, so you have sediment, debris, retardant, nutrient input into the aquatic environment. As you can imagine, impacts can be high to extreme, and they're also exacerbated for threatened species because these animals are already restricted and quite rare. So what to do? There is a simple but effective solution, and that is to remove a portion of the threatened aquatic species until the threat passes. But the key to this is that it has to be done as soon as possible following the fire, before you end up with those sedimentation events. These animals can be kept somewhere else in temporary captive management, and the trick is they can be returned once the threat has passed to either bolster the remaining population or, if worse comes to worse, re-establish species in the wild if it's become extinct. So really it's a simple insurance policy against extinction. Will it work? Yep, we've done this before. ARI has been involved in post-bushfire care since 2006. So therefore, we already had a whole series of methods, and we had facilities established before the 2019-20 fires. And as Tim mentioned earlier, a lot of the success is based on prior knowledge. We knew which were the vulnerable species, which were valuable populations, and also where they were, but also some of the access logistics. And the other key component to this is that we have had a long string of threatened species funding that has been non-fire related, but has provided some of this background knowledge. So it's a proven valuable tool for threatened aquatic species protection, but okay, we've done it for fish, but this time it was also new for freshwater crayfish and mussels. So which were the animals which were in most need? These were the ones that are considered the most vulnerable. For example, a lot of fish migrate, but it's the non-migratory species which have extremely limited movement capability. They can't get out of catchments, they can't get away from disturbances. The other one is species with very, very reduced distributions, such as just to a single reach, often in a single global population. Unfortunately, in East Gippsland, a lot of these species had greater than 60% of their distribution in the fire footprint. Often it was greater than 90%, sometimes it was 100%. And all of these species are known to be impacted by post-fire sedimentation debris flow. It's like trying to live in Vesuvius, when Mount Vesuvius erupts. You just can't live under that sort of conditions. So the species have lost resistance and resilience to change. They're at the highest ends of the endangered or critically endangered categories. These species were animals like the river blackfish, a series of galaxids, which are small native scaleless fish, 2 types of crayfish, but also a suite of mussels. Reconnaissance and salvage. What were the issues we faced? What I mentioned before, the key was time before rainfall events can occur. One of our major issues with that was the logistical issues of getting access to the fire ground, that is getting permission. But once we did, we were also blocked by tracks that had trees on them, dangerous trees swinging up there, but also burnt bridges. And then when we finally did get out, often a lot of the sites had already had sediment impacts. So then one of our next issues was that there was a lack of animals actually to extract. We undertook extraction of animals using primarily electrofishing. It's a very simple technique that stuns the animal and allows them to be retrieved and they recover. And you can see how difficult it is going for freshwater crayfish. You're on your hands and knees and you're gently feeling around to try and locate them in the substrate. An example of one of the sites we went to was Yucca Creek. This is near Orbost. Unfortunately, we were a little bit late getting there. We should have been there the day before, but in between there was a massive rainfall event. A big flood spike came down the stream, very high water velocities. There was overland flow. This called bank erosion and slumping. A lot of ash and sediment and other debris was washed into the water. It was highly turbid, and the bed and banks were even smothered in sediment. And you can see an image there of a freshwater eel. It was up on the bank and it was dead. And if you know much about fish and eels, hardly anything killed them. And unfortunately, we never found a single river blackfish, yet this was a really high priority site for river blackfish in Gippsland. Small freshwater animals like the ones I'm talking about don't need huge transporters to bring them back. We could fit in a hell of a lot of animals into our vehicle. Mainly they were carried in these plastic 60 to 80 litre tubs. They were insulated. They also had air supply and prophylactics provided. Overall, we were targeting about 18 species. We were only able to locate populations of 2/3 of those. We estimated we would be after about 1,700 individuals. We ended up bringing back just over 600. We brought them back to the Arthur Rylah Institute into what we call our intensive care unit. It looks like a crazed scientific lab, but you need all that equipment just to keep the environment going for the animals. So the key to the aquatic animals is we are responsible for their entire aquatic environment when we have them. So that's the water, the oxygen, the food. It's like, you know, looking after a guy in a spaceship. You can see the green algal mix in the bottom. It looks shocking, but gee, the freshwater mussels love that. So threat monitoring. We couldn't take the animals back into the wild until the threat had abated, and the threat, which is the sedimentation, is directly related to the amount of vegetation recovery. This is an image in about May. You can see very little ground covers come back and there's hardly any overstory. These two images are in June. You can see a little bit more ground cover, so some of the ferns are coming back, even fern fronds providing a little bit of canopy shade, but still hardly anything. There are slabs and slabs of sediment along the banks. The water's still very turbid. But once spring came, so this is bottom left is an image, I think it's in November. You can see there's a lot more ground cover, canopy covers starting to come back. So we considered that the right time to start taking some of these animals back. But a note of caution, up in the catchment, there was still massive areas of huge bed load just sitting there waiting to move on the next intense rainfall events. Animal return, we started taking them back from captive management about 8.5 months later, and we were honoured to be part of the Gunditj Mara welcome home to country for Bocara timbon, which is their Glenelg freshwater mussel. So this was in the Crawford River area. The return home for some of the other animals wasn't as striking. Really, it was just leisurely taking them back out, putting them back into their home habitats and carefully placing them. But before we put them back in, we made sure the in-stream conditions were also fine. So our achievements, it was pretty basic, but it was valuable. We established insurance populations of threatened animals. We took them out, we managed them, and we returned them. In essence, that was the major achievement. No populations or species were lost. I'll come to that. Though population declines due to sedimentation events and poor water quality had occurred, with some populations having declined immediately after the fire by 30 to 50%. Our only problem is the Yalmi galaxid. We were able to find one individual during the fire, and that was it. The other good thing was we developed protocols for mussels and crayfish in terms of captive management. We've undertaken some post-release monitoring. Most species are recovering, but recovery is slow for some taxa that were majorly impacted. We have not found another Yalmi galaxid yet. There is a lot of country that we can't get to, so hopefully they are still extant. And next steps, we'll continue monitoring some of these taxa, particularly the majorly disturbed ones, such as the Yalmi galaxid, because there is so much sediment still in the catchment, and it will be coming out of that catchment for decades. And lastly, as a broader approach, we aim to improve the population or species resistance and resilience to this type of disturbance. Again, we couldn't have done this without a major group effort. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Gemma and I'm an ecologist working at the ARI and I work in the threatened fauna team. So thanks so much for coming along today. It's really great to be sharing this work with you and sharing it on behalf of our team, Jenny Nelson, Louise Durkin and Phoebe Masek. So we've been working pretty hard over the last 12 months undertaking glider and owl surveys in East Gippsland, and that's what I'm going to cover today. So we had two key target species for these surveys, the greater glider and the yellow-bellied glider, and we focused mostly on the greater glider due to its conservation status. Apart from the direct mortality of the fire, the key impacts for these species derive around loss of den trees and foraging habitat. So in Victoria, the desktop assessments that Tim mentioned that were undertaken suggested that up to 35% of modelled glider habitat burnt in those fires, and up to 18% of this was affected by high severity fire. So today I'm going to be talking through two different assessments that we undertook, and I'm going to talk about each of them separately because we had a bit of a different approach for each. So in assessment one, we were looking at habitat refugia through the landscape. So places where there was intact eucalypt canopy, and this tended to be areas that were burnt at low or moderate severity. So we had some areas north and south of Cann River where we worked, which you can see in these red circles. For assessment two, we took a bit of a different approach. We returned to occupied sites where there were pre-fire records of greater gliders prior to those fires in 2019-2020. And these records had been submitted to the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. So we went back to these places and we focused on highland forests around Bendock and Errinundra National Park near the New South Wales border. And we also had some sites either side of Swifts Creek. So here are our two target species, the greater glider here on the left and the yellow-bellied glider on the right. So in total, we set up 61 sites, and at each we installed a 500-metre off-track transect, and we went during the day to undertake a rapid habitat assessment. Then we returned at night time with 2 observers and undertook an independent repeat survey at the same transect point, with the 2 observers separated by 100 metres. And this is a method that we've been using a lot over the last couple of years because we've found it really helps increase the detectability of greater gliders on a transect line. So what did we find? In the first assessment, where we were looking at habitat refugia, predominantly in the lowland forest of East Gippsland, we didn't detect any greater gliders at our site, but we did detect yellow-bellied gliders at 48% of sites. In the second assessment, where we were returning to pre-fire records, mostly in the highland forests, we detected greater gliders at 57% of sites and yellow-bellied gliders at 53% of sites. So we did see some declines for greater gliders at occupied sites where they were prior to the fires, but they persisted at almost 60% of sites, which was maybe a bit higher than we had originally anticipated. We had quite similar results to other post-fire surveys that were happening in Victoria at the same time, especially in relation to the yellow-bellied glider results. So WWF were undertaking surveys in the areas around Bairnsdale and Orbost, and ecological consultants Zach Atkins and Phoebe Burns were working further east around the Mallacoota-Genoa area. And all the survey programs really found that yellow-bellied gliders were at an average of 50% of the sites that were surveyed. Where our results differed were that we had a higher proportion of occupied sites for the greater gliders. So WWF had about 30% of their sites occupied, and the further east near Mallacoota and Genoa, it was less than 10% of sites. So whether or not that's because we worked a lot in the higher elevation forests versus lower elevation forests, it's a bit unclear at this stage, and it's a bit of an interesting pattern that would be good to look at further. Gliders were detected more frequently in unburnt forests and forest burnt at low or medium severity compared to forest burnt at high severity. And this was a pattern that we found for both species of gliders. But we do have to be a little bit careful at overinterpreting this because our sites weren't selected evenly across all the different fire severity categories. So we did a lot of sampling in low or medium severity forest. So we want to look at that in a bit more detail to tease into that pattern. And we're going to undertake some additional glider surveys this year under some new funding that we've secured, which is great. Okay, so moving on to large forest owls. In our owl surveys, we had 3 target species, the powerful owl, which you can see here in this image, the sooty owl and the mast owl, and these are all very forest dependent species. The key impacts of the fires relate to loss of hollow-bearing trees, which they use for roosting and nesting, and also prey species across the landscape. So the assessments undertaken suggested that up to 54% of modelled owl habitat burnt in the fires, and up to 26% of this was affected by high severity fire. We made the most of being out in the forest undertaking the glider surveys to build in the owl surveys into our survey program. And because of that, we only surveyed at a subset of sites. So we undertook call playback from the road at 37 of our sites. So what did we find? We had really low owl detections. So we detected sooty owls at 8% of sites and powerful owls at just 5% of sites. So the low detections of the forest owls is probably fairly unsurprising. All of these species exist at really low densities across these landscapes. And they also have really low detectability. So we were only able to go to sites once, but really to do a very thorough survey, you need to go multiple times and at times of the year where there's really good call playback response. But just to put our results in a bit of context, we undertook some surveys just prior to the fires in eastern Victoria under some funding that we received to do regional forest agreement surveys. And we had really similar results, so very low detections of forest owls. And similarly, the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network have been doing surveys since the fire and have also been detecting owls at very few locations. So we had too few records to assess any patterns based on fire severity. And as I said, you'd really need to undertake a very targeted survey program at pre-fire locations and make sure that you visit sites multiple times and repeat this in seasons when response rates are highest. So that's more what the East Gippsland Conservation Management Network are doing at the moment. So we'll wait and see what their results are suggesting. Okay, so just to wrap everything up into one quick last slide. We found that, you know, as Tim mentioned, protecting unburnt forest patches and hollow-bearing trees in these landscapes from further disturbance is probably really important for these species. So many of these patches are now fragmented and isolated from each other and spread across the landscape. So these refuges are really critical for populations. Now, the forest will become suitable again into the future, and it may take some time, particularly depending on how many hollow-bearing trees are available. So protecting and managing glider populations inside and just outside the current fire extent will be really important. Being able to support recruitment into these areas and allow populations to spread out through the landscape over time. Thinking about future habitat is also really important. So Melbourne Uni have done some modelling for greater gliders and have come up with some models in Victoria suggesting where important climate refuge areas for this species, so places that are going to be wet and cold for longer. And thinking about these locations and where they're situated is also really important to consider. The pre-fire data was really crucial for our assessments. So as I mentioned, we had some of this from regional forest agreement surveys that we'd undertaken just prior to the fires. And there was some available from other DELWP survey programs, so things like the Forest Protection Survey program. But it really was limited in some locations in East Gippsland. And that just made it really difficult to assess the impacts of the fire. As Arn was kind of saying, it's a matter of trying to work out where the species there prior to the fire and have they declined just from the fire, or had they already declined from some other disturbance or even due to climate. It's really difficult to tease this stuff out unless you've got this pre-fire data. And finally, we had really great collaboration with the external groups. And that meant we could all spread out across the landscape and make sure that there was no overlap in the surveys and that different buckets of money were getting used in the most efficient way. So I'd really like to thank all of our partners, anyone who helped us with logistics or sharing data or even helping us undertake the surveys. We really appreciate it. So thanks. I'm going to pass on to Peter, who'll be talking about glossy black cockatoos.
I'm going to talk about a single species, the glossy black cockatoo, and it's one for which we were lucky enough to have data from before the fires, and then we tried to match that with data after the fires. I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-author here, Martin Schultz, who's a field ecologist based in New South Wales who undertook all of the field work for this project with his usual enormous enthusiasm and energy. So we're concerned about the glossy black cockatoo for two main reasons. Firstly, its dietary specialization. You can see the distribution, the wide distribution in Eastern Australia in the distribution map there. In any given part of that area, it relies solely on the seeds of one or two species of she oaks, Allocasuarina. And furthermore, they eat the seeds when they're green, in green, immature cones. In Victoria, there's one preferred food tree, the black she oak. And this is an unparalleled degree of dietary specialisation amongst Australian birds. And it requires the woody cones to remain on the tree for extended periods for there to be food supply year round. And it seems that the cones of, say, the black she oak remain in that immature condition for months. And that's the only way the cockatoo can be assured of having a food supply. So food availability likely sets a ceiling on population density, which is always low. The second main reason for concern is there's sensitivity to fire, both hot fire and cool fire. So hot fires kill allocasuarinas, burn the cones, burn the food supply. Cool fires cause the cones to open and shed their seed. And once the seed has been shed, it's no longer available to the glossy black cockatoos because they simply don't feed on the ground. They only feed in the trees. So this combination of factors creates a severe threat to this species, especially so under climate change when fires are likely to become more common and more intense. So what did we do? Before the fires, we had begun a study of the distribution and habitat of glossy black cockatoos in Victoria. We're fortunate again with glossy black cockatoos in that they leave a characteristic and unique feeding sign beneath the trees in which they've been chewing on the cones. And you can see in the photo there the honey-coloured chewed remnants of black she oak cones that have been eaten by the cockatoos. And the glossy black cockatoo is the only species that does this. And that's really critical because if we were to rely on trying to get sightings of the birds, we would never get enough data to be able to draw any conclusions because of their low population density. So we used a stratified random sampling procedure based on a habitat distribution model prepared by colleagues from ARI to select some 170 point sites within the distribution of both the cockatoo and the she oak. And also the sites were within 500 metres of a vehicle track, so that it didn't take too long to get to them. And Martin navigated to 170 of these sites and recorded categorical data about the trees and evidence of the presence of feeding sign. So we collected data on the density of she oak stems and the size classes of she oak stems, the abundance of cones on the trees and cone age, as well as obviously the feeding sign. When much of the glossy black cockatoos range was burnt in the fires in 2019-2020 summer, we were presented with a great opportunity to investigate fire impacts on our study sites. So we went back to all the sites that actually had black she oak at them. And there were 84 sites out of the 170. So about half actually had black she oak trees at the point, which is pretty good effort for the model. And we found that 36% before the fires, 36% of those 84 sites had glossy black cockatoo feeding sign. And you can see on the map there, the black crosses are sites which had no feeding sign, and the black dots are sites which had feeding sign. So 36% were positive, if you like, pre-fires. After the fires, well, the fires burnt 64% of the modelled habitat of the glossy black, and 26% of that was at high intensity. And if you look at the map, which is the same map as the previous one, except that it's got fire intensity overlaid on it, and the post-fire results, most of the best habitat was in the eastern part of East Gippsland, over towards Mallacoota, and that was the area that was the area of the cockatoos range that was most intensively burnt. So that after the fire at the burnt sites, the frequency of feeding sign was 6%. That's a decline of 83% from the pre-fire condition. And you can see on the fire intensity map, this large green area over here in the west, that's basically between Lake Tyers and Orbost, which was unburnt, had a higher frequency of feeding sign being present. In fact, the frequency did not change at all between the pre-fire condition and the post-fire condition. So this suggests that the population density in that unburnt area had not changed. In other words, it seems likely that birds from the burnt area did not disperse into the unburnt areas, into this very quite large area, unburnt area, which implies that there was a large population reduction within the burnt areas. It seems as though birds whose habitat had been burnt had limited capacity to move into unburnt habitat, presumably because that unburnt habitat was already occupied and probably close to carrying capacity. So that's the main outcome that I want to talk about today. The implications of these findings are there's a really urgent need to protect stands of black she-oak from fire. We need to map the stands and consider how best to minimise the risk of fire to each of them. And I'm pleased to report that our Gippsland DELWP colleagues have embarked on that process, and we hopefully will have all the important stands of black she-oak in the databases which are used when planning burning activities. And the other important action that people can take, everyone can take, is to include black she-oak in revegetation projects, both on Crown land and on private land. So if people are involved in revegetation in burnt areas or revegetation projects anywhere in East Gippsland, so east of Bairnsdale, I would encourage everyone to include black she-oaks in their plantings. And thanks to some of our colleagues from ARI, particularly members of the spatial team for producing the habitat models. Edward Sen is a volunteer who helped in defining the randomised sampling sites, and my colleague Casey Stomation manages the databases and produced the maps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I'd like to just thank each and every one of our presenters today, Tim, Tamo, Gemma and Peter. An exceptional set of talks and exceptional amount of work that's gone into this, and we really appreciate you all taking the time to share this with this audience. For those who are following the chat, I think you can see how dedicated these people are. They've already got ahead and started trying to answer as many questions as possible, and I really appreciate that effort from each of you, and I'm sure our audience does too. I'm going to send a few questions through. We did lose a little bit of time with a little bit of tech issues, but I think we'll try to get at least one question to each of our presenters. So I'm going to start with Tim. This is a question around pre-existing knowledge about threatened species. It's been clear that in this work, that understanding of these species and their natural history has been incredibly important to our response, especially to bushfires and other catastrophic events. How do we support generating this knowledge in future and making sure we have the right information to manage these species and support their recovery after future disasters?
Great question, Andy, and thanks for the person who posted that one. Yeah, look, it is really important, as we emphasised, and I think it came through really clearly from all those talks as well, how important that information is. How we get there, it doesn't have to be the most expensive monitoring, broad-scale monitoring program in the world. It's a bit about being smart with the data that's collected by us, other people in the ecological community. Getting that data into the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas is really critical, and some groups are great at doing that. Others, potentially are a bit slower than they could be, but making sure that data is really high quality is super important. Getting it into places like Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, really important. Obviously, we're continuing to seek funding to try and establish these long-term programs, design it, bring it together, bring the partners together who can produce that data as well. There's a whole lot of approaches we take to that. We're pretty opportunistic, particularly at ARI, with bringing bits of information together as well. So we've been fortunate in a couple of cases here, as you would have seen with the glossy blacks, some of the fish stuff and some of the places we did have pre-survey data. We don't want to rely on luck for this sort of thing though either. So we do want to have a more comprehensive approach, and that's something we're certainly pursuing.
Thank you very much, Tim. Tamo, this one comes to the rescues that you've done. You did talk about not being able to get to some freshwater species soon enough. A person's posed to you a scenario. Fire's just burnt an area. How long does it typically take you to get out there to rescue them? And how often do you beat the rain? Obviously, this is complicated about the number of sites you're trying to save, but also there's the aspect of safety for our researchers. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tamo?
Yeah, it's a simple question with a very complex answer, obviously, because each time we've gone through one of these fire scenarios, we've learnt new things. And this, because it was such a large event and we had such a large spread of land to try and get into, we definitely learnt a lot more about the need for also having some relationship with the land managers in the regions as well, getting the aquatic extraction process legitimised through post-fire recovery so that let's say the on-ground operators understand that we have a need to get through. And I guess if you look at that, I'm going to cheat here and I'm going to avoid the question, because one of the other threads actually talks about what could you do to improve it. And one of those ways is to actually be proactive and potentially remove animals before they get burnt. That obviously takes away the need to be out there when it's raining. That's a big step, but I don't think it's that much different to what we're already doing. We already know which direction fires are going. We've got very good fire prediction. It is a step we could take that it would improve that whole process.
Thank you very much, Tamo. My next question I'm going direct to Peter, and this is, I guess, around the extensive collaborations that occurred throughout this bushfire recovery effort. And I know you work not only on the glossy black cockatoos, but a number of other really important threatened species. Would you be able to shed any light on just the partnerships and the collaboration aspect of this work?
Yeah, well, we had lots of help from people like Parks Victoria Rangers providing advice on access and track conditions and so on, as Tamo highlighted. And with things like the rescue of the eastern bristlebird, there was a highly specialist team put together from universities, BirdLife Australia, and as well as DELWP and Parks Victoria staff. It was needed to get in there and get people with the required expertise on site quickly. And I think they even used an Army helicopter to get to Malakuta in a big hurry when the highway was closed for extended periods. So yeah, the collaboration after the fires was quite heartening and yeah, essential for all of this work that we've been talking about.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, it's been definitely a really positive story of the fires, the collaborations it's inspired. I'm going to go to you, Gemma, and this is a question, I guess, that relates a bit to Tim's work when he was talking about entering data to the VBA, but there's a bit of curiosity on how you do your surveys and where the data goes and how many nights we're spending out there. Would you be able to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks everyone for the interest. Unfortunately, with this survey program, we were only able to go to each site once. And I guess we're always trying to make trade-offs about trying to get to as many places in the landscape as we can versus going to a smaller number of sites multiple times. But yeah, we've been working really hard on our spotlighting methods, particularly for greater gliders over the past couple of years. and trying to develop a method that increases the detectability of gliders. So whenever you're doing spotlight surveys, you're going to underestimate the number of animals that you see on a transect. But using the two observers, as I explained, sort of spaced 100 meters apart, doing the same transect in the same night, and then comparing observations, you get to the end of your survey, you compare, you walk back along the transect line together, you stop and you look at where you've detected all the animals and work out which ones both observers saw and which ones were sort of independent observations. And this has allowed us to sort of increase the number of animals that we're seeing at a site, which is really great. The other thing we do is that we collect all of our data according to a methodology known as distance sampling. And once you get enough records collected in the same way, spread across enough transects, you can actually undertake some pretty complex analysis, and you use the perpendicular distance out from the transect. And this allows you to generate a detection curve, and it also allows you to work out how many animals have been missed within the area. And then once you've done that, it's pretty powerful because you can look at different places in the landscape or different study sites and estimate the number of animals that you might have at that site with confidence intervals. So that's something that we've been really building on in the last, since 2017 actually, when we started working in the Strathbogie Ranges. And we do have a paper that's just been accepted and it's on the website, but the proofs aren't out yet. So I'll share that in the chat. But yeah, that's something we've been working on, and something we want to do in the future is build some models where we can predict the number of greater gliders across Victoria. We can get a bit of a handle on the proportion that might have been affected, a proportion of the population that might have been affected by the fires. And yeah, once we get a bit more post-fire data, all using the same methodology, we might be able to have a go at predicting how many gliders are left in that fire scar. So yeah, it's sort of a future plan and a wait and see. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or share any more information. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Arn, you're going to be my lucky last person I'm directing a question to. This first question from Tom has asked, is there much we can learn about how burnt rainforests will recover over time by looking at the recovery trajectory of rainforests in previous fire seasons? I know you alluded a little bit to this, but how do you think climate change is compounding that as well?
Great question. There's an enormous amount you can learn from previous fires, and that's very much a tool in our toolbox. The 2009 fires, for example, there was a dramatic increase in the regeneration of mountain ash all across these rainforest sites, to the extent that we estimate that 2/3 of the rainforest in the O'Shanassy catchment was now no longer considered to be rainforest. It's gone to a mixed forest. And so you get an enormous amount from it. Those figures that I showed, the graph I showed before for the encroachment of eucalypts into warm temperate, was almost identical to that graph that I generated after the 2009 fires. And that graph we generated after 2009 was actually 10 years later, which means that when you're looking at 3,000 or 4,000 stems per hectare in the O'Shanassy catchment, these stems were now sort of 10, 15 centimetre diameter at breast height. They were becoming they were large saplings already. So they weren't dying, they were persisting in there. And this is going to be the big problem with climate change. We're going to have a warmer climate, a drier climate. The fires will be more frequent. The fires will be hotter, which means there'll be more eucalypt regeneration on the edges. And there's just going to be this positive feedback loop, and this sort of squeeze on rainforest species as the eucs take over. So there's a lot to learn, and what we've learned so far is looking pretty scary.
Thanks so much, Arn. That's a troubling thing to be considering, I think, but hopefully we can do our best. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today, and for everyone who's hung on for a little bit longer after 2. We really appreciate you attending and making this all worthwhile. Thank you to all our presenters as well. We look forward to future talks from each of you. Our next talk will be in October, but we are yet to confirm the date. So keep an eye out. If you haven't subscribed to the ARI subscriptions and the ARI seminars, I encourage you to do so, and you'll find out exactly when our next seminar will be. For the rest of you who are taking part in the Nature Festival, enjoy the amazing number of sessions there are. There's a huge range of live events, but also anytime sort of activities. I do encourage you to go check that out as well. So thank you once again to all our presenters and to Fern for introducing this, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Andy.